Good morning, nerds. It is I. My players and I argue a lot. I use a lot of my own personal experience to inform the content on this channel. And one thing I come back to often is just how much my players and I, especially my current group, seem to argue. And this led me to a thought. How much should players and GMs argue in tabletop RPGs? Should they even argue at all? But before I manage to start an argument with my opinions on this topic, I have 3 buttons that I'd love it if you'd click, and those are like, subscribe, and the bell for notifications. If we want to talk about the arguments that happen in tabletop RPG groups, the first thing we need to do is narrow down what are the sorts of things that would cause these arguments. And to my mind, there are 4 main categories. And these are first and foremost rules disputes. The player thinks the rule works one way, the GM thinks it works another, and soap opera behavior ensues. The second one sounds similar but is in fact different, and that's narrative disputes. And this is really a dispute over some element of the story or world or other kind of broader narrative element that frames the campaign that is not the rules. This is different from a rules dispute, and a lot of RPG advice handles these two in pretty much opposite ways, as we'll get to in a second. I've had my fair share of narrative disputes before, both as a GM and as a player. But the most recent one that I was in came right at the end of a year-long Torchbearer campaign that I had been taking part in. I have told this story before, but it does bear repeating. My character was a halfling burglar, basically a rogue thief type of class. And given the Torchbearer is a very narrativist game, I tried to kind of soft plan out a narrative arc from him of a sort of rags to riches. He starts out with basically nothing to his name and the desperate need to get food into his belly, and over time he worked his way up until he became more and more powerful. At least that was my hope. And you know what? I got part of the way there. Early on in the campaign, I saved up enough money to buy a patent of lower nobility. And from there, I had some plans for my next steps. I would then purchase my burglar through the noble and august institution of simony, a low holy office, and then a high holy office. Now, why did I want to do this? In Torchbearer, the way that social status is expressed in the mechanics is through something called Precedence. It's rated from 0 to 7, where adventurers and prostitutes are at 0, commoners are at 1, the nobility is generally somewhere in the range of 3 to 6, depending on how important they are, and the highest of high priests in the setting are at 7. Now, per the rules, lower nobility gets you Precedence 3, low holy office gets you Precedence 4, and high holy office gets you Precedence 6. And yes, you do need to unlock them in order. So you can't quite get to level 7, unless you're a halfling burglar, because at level 10, they get +1 precedence. Not 1 precedence, +1 precedence. Which means that in theory, I could, with enough hard work, turn my dirty little peasant into the pope of the setting. That was incredibly exciting to me. And then we come to the session that took all my dreams and smashed them into teeny tiny pieces. We had gone off on an adventure to root one of our main rivals out of her personal estate, and while we were at it, we managed to loot a nice little magic hand axe. I already had a magic weapon, one of our other players also had a magic weapon, and so it fell to our third player to claim the hand axe for herself. We didn't really pay much mind. Nice little axe, nice abilities, move on. But then we returned to town, and it was at this point that we discovered that among its other benefits, this magic hand axe magically conveyed mayorship of the local town. And I was furious. You see, I had been working away for an entire year to try and build power and status for my character by combining the rules and the narrative in the way that Torchbearer really wants you to. This player had the same sort of power and status that I was looking for, just handed to her on a platter. So yeah, I was very, very annoyed, and I felt this whole situation was deeply unfair. I didn't really get much of a chance to express my frustration at this, as right after the session, the campaign fell apart for entirely unrelated reasons, mostly due to scheduling. But yeah, that is my experience of having a narrative dispute, and it kind of had something to do with the rules, but the rules were very much a secondary concern here. I wasn't feuding with the GM because he couldn't do that, but more a matter of him doing that being entirely narratively unjustified. And now we come to the last 2 types of dispute. First among these is table issues. These are things like players being late, power gaming, cheating, obnoxious player behavior, obnoxious GM behavior. All of that stuff is bundled up in here. Somebody has done some RPG-related behavior that is in some way considered inappropriate or amoral. And last but not least, we have personal dramas. And this is the stuff that happens that has nothing to do with a tabletop RPG in any way, shape, or form, but happens between 2 members of an RPG group. This can involve players being creepy, backstabby, gossipy, or any number of other disruptive group behaviors that would cause an argument. So, we know what the problems are. How are we supposed to solve them? And yes, my wording is deliberate here. A lot of conventional RPG advice for rules disputes is pretty simple. It comes down on either one of two forms. Either the GM has absolute power, or rules decisions should be made based on group consensus. This second one is newer and rarer, but I have seen it in RPG books before. And it's really not that different. In the end, because of the influence that GMs do have over their players, this second option really just boils down to, you have absolute power, but please be nice about it. Narrative disputes are generally resolved in the opposite direction, and usually the GM is meant to defer to the players on this. If a player wants to have some element in their backstory, GMs are often expected to adapt their world building or to prepare by leaving blanks in their world building so that players can sort their characters in. If a player has some sort of goal or arc in mind for their character, GMs are often expected to find some way to facilitate that desire. If narrative disputes are resolved in the GM's favour consistently, then the GM will start getting called a railroader. But as for table behaviours and personal dramas, the advice here is a lot more nebulous. Everyone has a slightly different level of tolerance for these things. The general rule is that you're either meant to talk it out or to kick out the person in question, or if the person in question is the GM, you're meant to leave. The main point of difference in a lot of advice you'll see is how much talking out you do and how long you wait before you throw the hammer down. But I think there's a problem here with a lot of this advice, but especially in the first two cases, and even occasionally in the third. None of this actually resolves the dispute. This is another story that I've told before, because it's very, very useful. In my last D&D campaign, I had a player join who had never played a tabletop RPG before. As such, in addition to not knowing the rules, he also didn't know the etiquette. While there were many disputes between us in his first few months in my group, I think the one that's most pertinent is our arguments over advantage. Pretty much every single time this player would roll, he would ask if he could get advantage. He would usually suggest some reason he thought he should get it, some of which were reasonable and some of which weren't. Of the unreasonable suggestions, the one that sticks out to me the most was the one he used for social roles. Advantage because I'm cute. Okay, that's a bit of a mean voice to be putting it in, but he deserves it. Now, every time that he made a suggestion for why he should get advantage, I reviewed it on the basis of merit. Sometimes I said yes, sometimes I said no. And every time I said no, he would argue back with me. And every time he argued back, I shut the situation down and got him to roll without advantage. It didn't matter how many times I shut him down, he would keep on going. And indeed, he took this whole thing rather personally. Every time he failed a roll that I denied him advantage on, he blamed me for it personally. Now, I should also note here that because he asked for advantage way more than all the other players put together, he also probably got way more advantage than all the other players put together. This was something that I noted. If a player gets refused the use of a bonus or a particular ability every now and then, that doesn't cause disruption at the table. But having this happen over and over and over, several times a session, every session, that was getting disruptive. And if I hadn't found a solution to this whole situation, then he would have had to leave the group. But find a solution I did. And it was pretty simple. I talked to him, out of game, I sent him a message. I explained why this wasn't working. I explained, in no uncertain terms, that I had absolute power over which rollers did and did not get advantage. I explained that while he was allowed to make suggestions, he would have to accept my results on them, and that no, I wasn't out to get him, I was just reviewing them on the basis of merit. I did not feel, and would never feel, that advantage because I'm cute was a valid reason for getting advantage. I also gave him suggestions on what to do instead, which fundamentally came down in his case to stop worrying about failing rolls, because that was why he did all this. He was very, very afraid of the consequences of rolling badly, and so part of what I had to do was give him assurances. That for the most part, if you fail a roll normally, then nothing happens. It's only if you roll natural one that something really bad happens. And even then, no matter how badly you roll on a roll, you'll usually get a chance to put things right later on. And that turned out to be enough. He calmed down, he stopped asking for advantage so often, and he stopped getting so angry when it was refused. Eventually, I even learned why he kept asking, advantage because I'm cute. And the reason is that he believed that he had given his character a cute character profile picture to put in Roll20, and for some reason he thought that entitled him to bonuses in game. I explained that there was no way in hell that could work for balance and fairness reasons, and he accepted that, and we all moved on. Kumbaya. When it comes to raising a dispute with someone, whether it be to correct toxic behavior, to make a complaint, or for any other reason, and this advice applies pretty much anywhere in life as well, but this is an RPG video, so that's what we're talking about. Whenever you're raising such an issue, I do have a few pointers on how to do it. First off, never ever 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 use insults or demeaning language. This includes directly demeaning language like calling someone an idiot, or toxic, or a narcissist, or anything else. You should also not insult them by implication. I know you're new, you wouldn't understand what's going on here. I know you're really privileged in this matter. I know this can be a bit complex, I'm going to break things down simply. Think before you speak, because it will help you. Beyond this, explain in no uncertain terms what the person is doing wrong and why. It's surprisingly common that people make complaints without ever explaining what they're complaining about. They're just, I'm unhappy, I'm not enjoying the session, that was inappropriate. Why? What was the issue? What caused it? How did it make you feel? Explain all of these things in a detailed, not insulting fashion. And then tell people what they need to do differently. There are plenty of times when people just say, stop being toxic, stop asking for advantage all the time, stop getting in the way of all my character's goals. The problem with all of these is that they are negative statements. They're saying do not do something, stop doing something, yada yada. Now, what do people interpret these one of two ways? The first way is they'll either just drop the stop or the do not, and all they will hear is be toxic, ask for advantage, get in the way of my character's plans. The other way is they will actually try and change their behavior, but not know what to change to, get confused, and end up falling back into their old bad habits. The way you get past both of these is to suggest an alternative course of action. Most of the time when your character gets advantage, I will tell you. You don't need to ask that often. And if you get told no, accept it, and if you then fail, accept it, and you also don't need to constantly defend yourself from failures. Although the effects of roles will stick around for a little while, eventually you'll get another chance to right your wrongs and to undo the damage of your previous role. Just wait around, be patient, be respectful, and you'll get the chance to do what you want. That is an example of how to actually propose an alternative course of action. And then the final step. Give people a chance to improve. In fact, maybe even give them multiple chances to improve, especially if you see some signs of improvement, but they're not all the way yet. I have something of a personal dislike of zero tolerance policies, because fundamentally they prevent people from learning. If you get thrown out for some infraction with potentially a well-explained reason, but also potentially not, you're just going to move on to another group and just keep repeating the behavior and keep getting thrown out and thrown out and thrown out. If you give people multiple chances so that they can improve, there is a chance that you will prolong their negative behavior, but there is also a chance that you will end their negative behavior, not only in your group, but in every future group they attend. That is the power of giving people chances. Now, sooner or later, those chances need to run out. You can't let someone abuse your kindness forever. But throwing people out at the first sign of trouble is, quite frankly, excessive. And that is why, in my opinion, you should only remove players and only leave the groups of GMs if they refuse to learn from their mistakes. So we've discussed how to handle an argument, but sometimes the argument itself is not the issue, it's just the sheer number of them. So how many arguments is too many? Well, I think the first and rather strange point to be made here is that no arguments are actually too few. Put simply, when there are no arguments going on at a gaming table or in any other situation, it's usually not because there's no disagreement. No two people are in perfect agreement about everything. What is usually happening is that there is disagreement, but nobody is talking about it. And if nobody is talking about it, then there is no chance of resolving it. These disagreements will fester and fester and fester until one day they come exploding out in a great orgy of destruction. There are some issues that can be caught early and with a bit of negotiation can be sorted out. And so a healthy group does need a certain minimum amount of arguments, not because creating disagreement is good, but because resolving disagreement is good. But constant drama will destroy a group. And there's two ways it can do this. The first is that the sheer amount of time that gets wasted on arguments will not only cut into sessions and kill the pacing of any campaign, it will also just really annoy everyone and make people stop enjoying the game and feel like they want to leave. And now we come to yet a third previous story. I promise I'll make this one quick. A couple of years back, I was in a cyberpunk red group that switched over to Savage Worlds, and switched over locations from Night City to Miami at the same time, for various in-game reasons. Now, when we moved over, one of the other players and I found some opportunities to get involved in the local politics of near Miami. And in my character's case, he climbed the political ladder all the way up to the mayorship. And this seemed very hunky-dory to the player and I, and also to the GM. but there was one person who really wasn't on board, and that was our third player. You see, before coming to Miami, we had been doing the typical episodic edge runner, mission here, job there sort of thing. And he wanted to keep doing that. And his way of expressing that was to start a half an hour long argument at the beginning of every session, which meant the GM, the other player, and I had to take precious time out of our gaming sessions to shout him down and get him to comply with us, at least for the rest of this session, only to repeat it all 7 days later. And then there came one session that I had to miss due to a mixture of injury and exhaustion. When I checked the Discord after when the session would have been, I saw that this argumentative player had left. And when I asked him about it in DMs the next day, he gave me the answer I expected. He started an argument about how the campaign was going, he got shouted down, he got angry, and left. The moral of the story here is that not every argument is reconcilable. Sometimes groups just won't get along, and if someone doesn't leave, then the group will fall apart. The final note that I want to end this section on is a bit of a warning. It doesn't really matter how many disagreements you resolve, because it only takes one of them to completely unravel your group. Now, this can be taken optimistically or pessimistically. If you take it pessimistically, then you're always one argument away from falling apart, and that is something to be mindful of. But there's another more optimistic way to look at this. It doesn't matter how many disagreements you get through as long as you resolve them. As long as you manage to keep clear of that one fatal disagreement, as long as you always find reasonable negotiations, then none of those disagreements will affect the harmony of the group in the long run. There will just be short-term bumps. Some groups will have more, some will have less. But all successful groups exist not because they didn't have disagreements, but because they successfully resolved them. And that is the point that I want to end this video on. The question of whether I argue with my players too much is a non-question, because every argument that I've had with them, I have managed to resolve. I have not had that one great unraveling moment with my current group, even if I have had it with previous ones. And so when you find yourself in a situation where you and another player, or you and the GM, are in an argument, rather than looking at it as a vulnerability for the group to fall apart, look at it as an opportunity for the group to get stronger, as a potential damaged link in the group's chain getting repaired. And you know what? Not all of these links will be repairable. Sometimes the chain will break. Sometimes one little piece will break off, sometimes the whole thing will come apart. But in that latter case, there is always the next group. These things happen. Human interests don't always align, no matter how hard you try to make them do that. But the one thing that'll make all of this easier is if discussions between the GM and the players are always built on mutual respect. You need to view the other person as a human being, with their own opinions and feelings, and whose grip on reality is just as weak and subjective as yours is. If you can manage that, then healing the wounds in your group will get much easier. And of course, the final warning. If you keep having issues with groups, and especially the same issue in different groups, remember how I said that people need the room to change? Well, if your group doesn't give you that room, then you need to give yourself that room. That's just how it is. But hopefully, of course, things will never come to that point. And it's a wrap. Thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then please like it, share it with your friends, and leave a comment down below. What's the biggest argument you've had to deal with in a group before, and how did you solve it? If you'd like to see more videos like this one, then please subscribe and hit the bell for notifications. It really does help the channel. And once more, thank you all so much for watching, and until I see you next, farewell.